don't worry, you're going to get more than your brains will hold probably tonight. But I won't be doing the additional one, no. And I'm actually working with my daughter-in-law, Naylene. She actually is giving me some ideas. She sent me some stuff over just today to help with engagement, especially because the way I teach, especially for younger kids, not as much for you guys, but for younger kids, most of the time they don't read the material. And the way I teach is a reiteration of the material and then elaborating on it. Well, if you don't read it, then it's just confusion. And so she's given me some exercises because I don't know if I'm relating to 5th and 6th graders as good as I used to. It has changed. Just in the couple of years when I had Nathan and Luke in 5th and 6th compared to the 5th and 6th grade I have now, the stuff that would work for them does not work. It's wild. Such a short span of time. As far as retention, able to get through the material, reading, all of it.
Study habits are going to
well, I think it's a combination of things. I don't know, and I'm not an educational analyst, but things have changed. And so the way I relate, kids are just having a hard time. They're just not retaining, they're not. So I'm learning as I go and evaluating. So, but we'll see. So hopefully this will work as well. So, all right, cool. So, of course, questions and discussions. We have the 3 books that we're going to work over. Tactics, obviously, is going to be the last one. I don't have enough faith will be the one we primarily spend time on. But we're going to start with the questions. Now, if I am not mistaken, week 10, the only thing that's really accurate when it comes to the syllabus, because of the changes, either because we've been gone or whatever, is that you should be through John 13. Okay, and John 13 really starts my favorite parts of John, where we start getting into the discourse, discourse on the last night. So starting in 13, a lot of the teaching about the Holy Spirit, going through chapter 17, which is, a lot of people call it the high priestly prayer, and then 18, we start into the death and resurrection of Christ, or the final week. So what thoughts and questions did you guys have over John 7 to 13? Anything in particular? Maybe something you didn't notice before?
For that last night with Jesus talking, it'd be a little hard to understand everything that was going on.
Well, I even spoke in parables to, a lot of the times, his disciples didn't know, are you speaking figuratively? Are you speaking plainly? And, even to the point where he says, now I know you're talking to us plainly, I understand.
Especially when Judas asks him, is it I? And he specifically answers Judas, but no one else heard that evidently.
Well, and it's interesting because most of the time when we think about the Lord's or when we think about the Last Supper, we think about Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. That's not the way they didn't have chairs like that they sat in. Usually they were U-shaped tables. There were different degrees of those who were given honor at the time. It looks like John may have been very close to Jesus because Peter on the last night says, hey, John, ask him who he means. And then he tells John, the person who, after I've dipped this and give it to, that is the person. Judas may have been close by as well. So it could have been something that was only really exchanged between him and Judas. It may have been heard by the others because his response was, I think his exact response was, you have said, which is somewhat enigmatic. We'd have to go back and, depending on the translation or the thing that you're using. So there could be a lot of different reasons why there wasn't a reaction. Well, and it gives us a similar example where we have a misunderstanding when he says to Judas, go and do, and all the disciples, it says, thought that he was going to buy stuff for the feast because he was the keeper of the money bag. So with a lot of conversations going, probably as any table, there were probably things hit and miss. And so we can see that a lot of the times the disciples were afraid to ask Christ questions because why are you questioning among yourselves? No one wanted to look like the fool. So, but yeah. I was talking today, thinking about John, because when we get to the end of John, one of the things that John says is, of all the things that could be written about what Christ said and did, not all the books of the world could fill them. So I asked my students today, I said, how many days do we have actually recorded of the life of Christ in the Gospels and other things? What do you guys think? How many days, months, years, what do you think?
Like 156
Okay,
or something like that.
so 156. Any other guesses?
Well, I
His
thought,
ministry?
How many actual days do we have events recorded in his life? So how many days or months or whatever do we actually have a record of what actually was said and done? Or even a partial?
3 months, yeah.
Less than 51 days approximately. So if he had 3 years, 3.5 years of ministry, we have very little. And of course, the gospel writers were not giving us everything. They were giving us enough, as John says, that we could believe that he was the Christ, the Son of God, and so believe in his name.
in John especially, you get to the Passover pretty fast,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like, whoa, you're just right there. So,
Well, and you'll find out that most, and I can't remember the exact percentages, but if you look at the last 7 days of Christ's life, I think like in Mark, it's like 40 to 50% of the gospel is the last week. And you know why that's the focus. That's the pivotal moment of history in that regards. And so you look at that. I mean, we start in John 13, and we're in, 13 through 17 is pretty much within a couple hours that we have. So it's amazing. And that's why I think it's really neat to dive in to compare the Gospels, because they hit and miss at different places, different areas of his life. But there's a lot we don't know, that he did. So anything else that kind of jumped out at you as you read 7 through 13?
Isn't that when they ask, well, when are we going to see the Father? I thought that popped up.
When are we going to, show us the Father? Right. And I've been with you so long that you have to say, show me the Father. Yeah. You can see Christ got frustrated a lot with them. One thing though as well, and I've read different things on this, but I think we lose a lot in even especially chapter 8. Chapter 8 is what we call the great, well, there's like 7 great I ams, but the last one is before Abraham was, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him. And a lot of the times, I think we misunderstand that those I am constructions, and I've heard some differing opinion on this, but a lot of what I've read is basically said that when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the New Testament, that the way they translated the proper name of God was putting together 2 Greek words which mean I am, ego and eimi. And so when in some of these statements, especially when he said before Abraham was, I am, he was actually using the translation that everybody would have known he was using the proper name of God as ascribing to himself. So unfortunately with a lot of the English, that's why it's always good to have a good, solid commentary. And even if you can get into some of the Bible software, because some of those gems really come out. Because people say he never claimed to be God. Well, yeah, here's one instance where he's using the Greek version of the proper name of God for himself, and even said before Abraham was, I am, And so there's interesting things like that in 7 and 8. And in John, we get a lot of the I am statements. I am the door, I am the way. And so John is powerfully packed. All right. If we don't have any other questions, then we will move on. Now we will go on and go over, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Now actually, the thing that we're going to talk about tonight is one of my favorite arguments for a number of reasons. If my clicker could work. There we go. Is because I also think it's the most self-evident. Meaning, I don't think a lot of people need the proof. When you get into science and math, a lot of the times you have to help them understand the concepts. Where morality is intuitive. It's something we all experience. And so I think it's much more easy to relate to because everyone's experience contains value judgments, contains what we believe is right or wrong, good and evil. And so it's something that I think comes to the heart. It's also the center of a lot of our passions. Because just look at the younger generation. Social justice is huge, which social justice is a good thing. Now, how they formulate that and what their foundation is can be scary at times. But we can then take that passion that is wrapped up and we can help them to see that morality is something that exists. And if it exists, and if its characteristics and qualities are what he describes to a certain degree in the book in chapter 7, there has to be a God. So I think in that aspect, it can be a very persuasive. Okay, so just kind of to show where we are and where we've been. So, truth about reality is now most of these, obviously, now I'm going to turn that back on and see if my clicker will work a little better. Okay, what we see is that through these are what we've gone through so far. So, truth about reality is knowable. He even actually goes in and says very similar things can be said about morality. That truth about morality is knowable. It's also undeniable. Okay? We use it all the time. I don't think people realize how much we use value judgments, but yet how little we evaluate what those value judgments are based on. Okay? The opposite of true is false. We're going to get this a lot in the chapter that we read for tactics. Tactics is the suicide tactic, which the authors of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist called the Roadrunner. So really that was a different perspective on the law of incoherence, where something is necessarily false. If it is incoherent, it doesn't stand up to its own standards, okay? So hopefully that would help your understanding as you read that, and he gave some different examples. I also like in tactics, and we'll get to it when we get to that portion, is that he also goes through some of the main sound bites, if you want to call them, that the culture will throw at you, that are what he says commits formal suicide. They're incoherent, and we can dismiss them. We help people to see that they're incoherent, okay? Now, we're starting to go into trying to show them that since we can know things, since the opposite of true is false, we can start evaluating and we can prove that this is a theistic universe. We did it first by the beginning of the universe, then we did it by the design of the universe, then we did with the design of life. Okay, so basically the two teleological arguments are the same argument, one reflecting on the cosmos, the other one reflecting on biologic life. But they're both arguments from design. Now, the one we're going to touch on today is the moral argument, okay? The moral law. So it's interesting. So, starts out in chapter 7 and names it Mother Teresa versus Hitler. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, a lot of the times when I've brought this up to people, they object to it because they say people didn't live that way. Our neighbors behind us, I was talking to one of their kiddos, and they said they all owned slaves. They all had certain, and I bring up and I said, okay, we know that morality can be transgressed, but that doesn't invalidate that morality exists. So a lot of the times I would call that the genetic fallacy. They fault the idea because the people who hold it didn't adhere to it. And so they're saying, well, it disqualifies. And we need to make sure that we look at that. Now, this statement obviously could not be produced probably nowadays on a secular or a government level. With the inalienable rights given by the Creator. And when we eventually get to the survey that I created that you guys can use, I really hit this in quite a few questions. Is it government that bestows human rights and those things? Can it be taken away? Or is it from God? Now, unalienable rights. What does unalienable mean?
Non-racist.
Yeah. It means it cannot be divested from. It cannot be taken away from. It's inherent in it. So this is something that cannot be granted by government or taken away by government. And when it's violated by the government, it is the right of the people to revolt. That was the opinion and the idea behind that. Okay? That George III was stepping on these inherent rights that he had no right to violate. Okay? Imagine that argument nowadays. Okay? But that is the foundation. And again, I know I've talked about it before. There's a great book out there called The Suicide of a Free People. We talked about it in the very first presentation we did when it came to the differences between what freedom meant at one time, freedom to do the right thing, and what it means now, freedom from all restraint. What certain words meant back and forth. Okay, so we will go on from there though. All right, so really when we think about this, I like the idea of a judge or someone that is arbitrating disputes or somebody who is trying to rectify a situation, especially with a lot of the youth and the younger kids, social justice. It rings true with them. So the moral law is the third argument for the existence of a theistic God, okay? And so it goes like this. And I want you to relate, this is the law of gravity. When we think about physical laws, like the law of gravity, do we see the law of gravity? It's a mathematical concept, or we could say, if math, as Carl Sagan says, or in contact, math is the universal language. It is told to us in language, but what do we actually see? Do we see the equations?
No, you just see the effects.
You see the effects. So most of the natural laws, in a lot of cases, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, we're really not sure what the law is. We just know how to describe it. We actually don't know certain things. We assume, and then we make models, and we make assumptions, and we go, yeah.
Are we the ones that called it the law of gravity, or did we determine it was a law?
We didn't determine, we discovered.
Just discovered it?
Yes.
That's what we refer to it as.
Yeah, and that kind of comes with language. We have how we know something, or how we explain something, or how we name something is different from what the thing in and of itself is. Gravity exists, whether we call it gravity in English or French or German, or if we use the mathematical equation. They all are describing the same thing, but that thing has reality in and of itself. And so natural laws are discovered, they're not invented. The same with the moral law. The moral law is truly what we would call discovered, not invented. And part of the survey questions that I'll have, and we'll talk about them at the end of class, is there is that difference between how we know something and whether something is true. There are two different questions, or if it exists. Because a lot of the times people confuse that. They think that if there's a progression in knowing, then it's created and not discovered. We'll get more into that in a second. Okay? So, but kind of think about some of these things that we'll go through similar to natural law. Okay? Or to physical laws, I should say. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Now, if you guys remember at the beginning of the book, we talked about how these arguments are made up. Okay? This is called a syllogism. Syllogism usually has two premises, 1 and 2, and if both of those premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows if everything is set up. Now, every law has a lawgiver. Not many people are going to debate that. Okay? They're going to assume that proposition 1 is correct. They're going to debate us when it comes to, is there actually a moral law? Because if there is not a moral law, then we don't come to the necessary conclusion that there is a moral lawgiver. Does that make sense to everybody? So remember when we talked about the cosmological argument, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. Remember, there has to be something eternal. So very few people argue against the first premise, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. No one usually argues against that. They've tried in certain instances. But the main one is that the universe has a cause. That is the one. And there's an article that Dave sent me just a week ago. I haven't been able to get to it yet. But it's about the possibility, so we're revisiting the issue if the universe had a cause. And I'm sure they're going to come up, I doubt they're going to come up with an answer. I'll just put it that way.
Pretty much what they used to think, that the universe is
Static.
That it's what?
eternal.
So it's static.
Did not have a beginning.
It did not have a beginning.
Had a different form at one time.
Did they give any evidential reasoning for it?
Not, it's just speculation and
Okay. Yeah, we can imagine anything, can't we?
stuff like that.
Yeah, okay. So I will take a look at that, and I'll get that printed so everybody here can read that. Okay, so simple enough. Now the part we will need to convince people of is if there is a moral law. Okay, so he goes in and he gives 8 in the book. We're just going to go over them fairly quickly. We won't, and again, I'm not giving the lecture the second half because we're going to cover most of that in this first half. And so it would become a little dry and redundant. So we'll just please ask questions on this part if you have any questions. So there are many reasons we know the moral law exists. We're going to discuss 8 of them that they give in the book. Some of these reasons, they overlap one another, okay? But kind of think about them each distinctly, and we'll kind of discuss them in this order. So the first one is, the moral law is undeniable. So do you guys remember that portion that he talked about? The moral law is undeniable. Any comments or thoughts or?
So, yeah, it's undeniable to all humans. In other words, whatever they believe, evolution, Big Bang, it's undeniable to them, they just don't know it.
Well, I think they even know it. Think of it this way. Remember at the very beginning that we talked about to make a statement that truth doesn't exist. What was the problem with that?
Is that statement true?
Yeah, is that same? So what do we call that? A self-defeating or self-refuting, which means it's necessarily false. Now, when it comes to morality, it's not necessarily an incoherent statement that there is no such thing as morality, okay? Because it is not referring to itself. But think of it this way, the livability of it. So if we would say that a incoherent statement is necessarily false, we know 100%, we've proven it false. What he wants to say is living, everything we do is a value statement. Everything is a moral judgment. Whenever you evaluate 2 things, you are evaluating the benefit or the problems with it, especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships, things along those lines. So what he is saying is when it's undeniable is when you claim you are making a value judgment when you deny it. Does that make sense? So you are imposing almost an amorality when you're claiming there is no morality. So it's not formally incoherent. It's not a contradictory statement. But when we think about how it's presented, they're expecting that they are giving you what they believe is right. Morality is not true. They believe that they're telling you something that's both true and good. Are you following me? Okay? And so in that sense, it really, to live it out is, the word's escaping me. Well, it'll come to me in a second.
So if I'm a true evolutionist, like a Darwinian evolutionist,
Right.
I would say to anyone, how dare you impose your moral law on me? Who made you the morality Nazi, boss?
Mm-hmm.
And, I would say that would be my statement to someone trying to impose any sort of morality on me. I would say, who made you the moral master?
Right. And we'll get into that when we get into naturalism, but along those lines, you're coming to the point that also we're making is that when somebody is basically declaring what they believe to be true, we're valuing them, we're giving the morality to them, okay? People want to value their opinion, they want to value, but yet they say value is meaningless, morality is meaningless. Okay? Is this kind of resonating? Morality is part of a field that's axiology. It's called axiology. And the axiology has other areas as well. It deals with aesthetics, with beauty. It deals with value structures. And is there such thing? Why do we value things the certain way we do? And so it does fall in because morality is a type of valuing in the sense of right and wrong, good and evil. Okay? So another thing that he really points out with its undeniability, and we think about reactions. We think about gravity. When you drop something, it falls. Treat someone unfairly. And what immediately do?
They're upset.
They cry wolf. Yeah. So we can say it's almost deniable because whenever it is inflicted on them, the cry for morality comes out. And so even though it is not 100%, undeniable in the sense of when we talked about incoherence, lividly, it's pretty much practically, it's undeniable. Okay? And that really leads us into the second one, that we know it by our reactions. You do, and you hear examples of this all over. Well, people will talk about it and say anyone who denies reality or denies morality, just do something to slight them, treat them unfairly, propose something like stealing their stereo, pouring boiling water on their head, and see how quickly they react. Okay? So it is in that sense, it truly shows when the rubber hits the road what they believe. They may claim anything, but if they truly believe it, then to cry foul is hypocrisy. It's a violation of what they hold to be true. Okay? So he goes on and he says, it is the basis of human rights. Why do you think it's the basis of human rights?
Well, society or humanity couldn't survive without it. It really, like a true evolutionist and like Darwin, it's survival of the fittest.
Right.
So the biggest, baddest dude in town gets his way.
Yep.
And no one can say, whoa, what you're doing is wrong. Nah, prove it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having a good time.
Oh, yeah.
But if we didn't have it, I mean, society would break down kind of like what it's doing now, because we're losing a lot of our morality. Not we as the church, I hate to say
Even within the church, we have a lot of breakdown.
Yeah, but I mean, overall, I think,
Right. We have a lot of confusion.
yes.
We have a lot of things that we feel, and we'll get to some of those objections as well, but we feel that we're there without a compass. But, you know, going along the lines of what you said, all we have to do is think about the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, one of the formal defenses that the German government or the German Nazis had is we were abiding by the laws of our land. There are no higher laws. You cannot judge us by your laws. We were abiding by the laws of our land. You have no right. And the justice, the Chief Justice, I can't remember his name, he was the Supreme Court Chief Justice that was overseeing it. His name will come to me at 2 a.m. But he said there is a law above your law. This is an appeal. Because if that is the case, if there is no such thing as moral law, it is might makes right. And that German defense, from an evolutionary standpoint, if evolution is true, what's wrong with the standard? Okay? Now, what the guy could have said is, well, we beat you, so now our might makes right, and we disagree with you. Okay? But then it's just constant power plays. There's no one to appeal to. Okay? But human rights, too, if they are granted by government, what can they be done by government? They can be taken by government. And that's why in our Declaration of Independence it says these are inalienable rights. These are inherent in people. You cannot step on them. The government cannot transgress them. And when the government does transgress them, then it is the moral, implication for the people to take up arms, as they would say in the Revolutionary War and that. Okay? So it is the basis, yeah. Dave?
Finish, it's the basis for human rights.
Yeah, basis for human rights.
If we go back to the preamble of the Declaration, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Right.
We say that because of the moral law, to interfere with someone's life, liberty, right to pursue happiness is wrong.
Yes. We would say that based on a creation model. And that's why they were very apt, even though many, not a large percentage, but some of the forefathers were deist in the sense of maybe not pure Christian, but they knew. When you look around, and you can go back all the way to Rome, and you find people that make arguments for how can you deny a deity when you look at the world around us. And so they at least said these have to come from a creator. You have to have a source outside of us to be able to arbitrate things between us. Because if there is nothing above us, the only way to settle a dispute is to either give in or to conquer. And most of the time it's to conquer.
It strikes me that when so many people today talk about human rights, they're talking about privileges that the government's granted.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Even when you hear debates about abortion, when you hear people, and it's funny because they'll say now with a lot of things going on in Texas and Mississippi, isn't it Mississippi? The other one that's coming before the Supreme Court December 1st? Mississippi, yeah. But anyways, when you look at a lot of the rhetoric coming out, they'll say that we are trampling a constitutional right. And you immediately think of the Constitution. But it's not written in the Constitution. It was created by judges who kind of massacred portions of it to create, but that was not a right. That was not. And in that sense, rights are privileges, or now we're getting to the point that they're what the government wants to create, dependent on the largest lobbying organization. We see it today with shaming and the cancel culture and the wokeness. You have Twix commercials that are selling different social agendas instead of products.
So they, on the women's side, it's my body, my choice, and it works for them. That's their slogan. That's their
And a lot of them,
argument.
right.
But when they want to impose, let's say the vaccination, it's my body, my choice. Oh,
Right.
no, it doesn't apply to that.
It brings a point up, is when and there's many difficult situations, we'll get into that in the objections, that sometimes because there's ambiguity, we believe that there's no morality because there's ambiguity. Well, just to say that there's a difficult math question doesn't mean that there's not an appropriate answer. And so we need to make sure that we relate it. But I think that, along those lines is a worldview that is created by rights that are granted and are not inherent because of the creator will end up in contradiction and they will fall apart. You're building castles in the sky because your foundation is not based in anything outside, but it's based in personal opinion. And we have as many opinions as we do people. And it's very interesting because we do see that many of these postmodern ideas, they're coming back to bite the ones who originally proposed them because they're not now far enough, or the slide scale has changed. Because when it is power politics, or when it is a lack of a true foundation that's objective that we can discover, find, and evaluate from, it is a constantly moving target. And that is a scary, scary world. But again, going back, I think that we as humans know God has built us into us, that based on the image of God, that we have a conscience. Now, it may be seared, but we still have those things. And I think being made in the image of God, all of us, it is a place where hopefully we can get people to start that resonating. You always hear about that little vibration that starts building and then shatters the glass. Hopefully with the moral argument, we can cause enough of cognitive dissonance that little shaking when it comes to something that they internally know to be true, that maybe it'll start rattling some of these other ideas. They can't provide the foundation. They can't give them answers, and constantly causes pain and problems. So that's one of the things. So it is the unchanging standard of justice. It's interesting, and I'm still looking for this. I read it once before, and I cannot find it. So if anybody can find it, let me know. There was an argument that Plato put forward that basically he believed in an afterlife because justice was not performed in life. And justice being the ideal. Now I'm paraphrasing, and this is a long time ago that I read it. I had it on a paper. I cannot find it. I've looked, I can't find, and maybe I'm mistaken. So this is from recollection. But it makes a good point. That what he basically said is, if justice is an ideal, then it is not perfected in this world. We see too much injustice. And so the belief in an afterlife just to make things right has been an argument in some cases. But when we think about an unchanging standard of justice, the only way it can be unchanging, and I'm focusing on the unchanging, is if it's set in something that's objectively true and does not change, like the nature and the character of God. If it's based on human subjectivity. I remember the discussion that I gave at the Right to Life banquet was, I think it shocked a lot of people to realize the widespread abortion, infanticide, and all of this. And really, when you look through the collection of the Roman and Greek authors, there seems to be no remorse. That it really wasn't an emotional case as it is today. It was just part of life, but yet Christianity comes in. So you have such drastically different views through the entirety of history. You have cases where in Sparta, you brought your child to the elders at a certain time and they would deem whether or not it would live. It was a communal good, okay? We look at the time where we had, where the Romans would expose and the Greeks would expose their children. Didn't matter, there were no repercussions for it. Nowadays, so what would justice be at that point? What is justice like under Hammurabi's codes? What is justice like under the old Mosaic law? What is justice like in modern day Europe? You have so many different variations, they'll always change if it's accordance to human opinion. Justice, and also justice, can be only founded when there is an objective right or wrong. Or really, it doesn't make much use of the term. Just and unjust becomes just opinion. Is this flowing for everybody, making sense? Yeah.
What really made sense in this section was C.S. Lewis, and I'll just read this part. Said C.S. Lewis was one such atheist. He believed that all of the injustice in the world confirmed his atheism. That is, until he thought about how he knew the world was unjust.
Well, and then he does the comparison between a straight line and a crooked line. How do I know what is crooked unless I know what is straight? You have to have a referent that is outside of you. And so, and that really gets to the next one. When it comes to, it defines a real difference between moral positions. It's not an illusory position between Hitler and Mother Teresa. It's a real distinction between good and evil. Okay? One of the quotes that I did like, and I had that noted, that C.S. Lewis quote. As you notice, there are so many C.S. Lewis quotes. He is a great, but I love this. Relativism is ultimately unlivable. He says, not always the standard by which we treat others, but it is nearly always the standard by which we expect others to treat us when we're talking about fairness. Okay? So when we go on, it defines a real difference between moral positions. He gives the example in the book of a map of Scotland. How good is the map of Scotland? Well, that all depends on how it correlates to the physical reality of what Scotland is. So when we look at positions, or we look at when we talk about, a lot of the times we talk about worldviews are a mental map of immaterial reality, concepts and ideas, thoughts, just as a globe is a map of the earthly things, okay? And so if we have an earthly map, we judge how good a map is by how effective it relates all the exactness of the physical reality. When it comes to morality, the only way it makes any sense is if there is something that it can be compared to that gives us either a better picture or a worse picture or a corruption of what the immaterial, the moral world is like. Does that make sense? And there is a real difference. There's a real difference between a good map of Scotland and a bad map of Scotland. Go to Scotland and try to use the bad map. See how well it suits you. The same is the reality of morality. It is. We see this in the destructiveness of lives. We see this in the way that decisions, values are made, that we can see the effects of those things. There is definitive and very defined differences. And we cannot let others get away with this idea that really there is no difference between Mother Teresa and Hitler. It was all a statement of opinion. No, one was evil and the other was not. In the sense, not our standing before God, but in what we would call a civil evil, obviously before God. But, okay, then the next one. Well, since we know what's absolutely wrong, there must be an absolute standard of rightness, because we make excuses for violating it. Is guilt real, or is it not? That's why I worry about a lot of modern day psychology when kids go to psychologists, because a lot of the times they'll be told that guilt is not real. They're being victimized. There are times when the guilt is not real, when we believe that we've done something wrong, when we haven't done something wrong. But there is actual guilt when we have transgressed, and we know that, and we make excuses for it. So really, even in those days when we want to deny it, it'd be interesting to see, because I wonder if when they're denying it, a lot of people get that pinch of, I don't believe that. I really don't believe that. This is, and they're thinking, we hear it all the time. When people have posed questions about, is it wrong to do such and such? You, a lot of the times, will get the case. It's not wrong, but I don't like it. Well, why'd you add the I don't like it? Because they know morally that there's something wrong. But it doesn't accord with what they're stating to be true. Does that make questions on that part? Any thoughts or questions? No? Okay.
Is that number 7? Is that number 7?
Yes, that's number 7.
Is there one moral law, or is there numerous moral laws?
That's 6, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's one law divided up into multiple statutes, or?
There is, I would say, if you wanted to express it that way, there is one moral lawgiver, and all the guidelines and laws that we have are based on his character. And so, different aspects of life. So you have different moral laws. And we have that expressed especially in the Old Testament with the 2 tables of the law. One is regards to our moral relationship to God, and the other one our moral relationship with his creation.
Yeah. And those are, there's 5 or 6 of those.
Depends on how you look at it. There's 2 different ways that people separate the 10 Commandments. It depends on which passage from Scripture. The tradition I'm from, we actually number the 10 Commandments the same as the Catholics do. Where a lot of your other Protestant denominations, they will number them differently. Now, they all are the same. But it depends on where you take. So when I look at it, if for my accounting, the first 4 is, you shall have no other gods before me. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Honor your father and mother. Not honor your father, keep the Sabbath day, or remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy is the 3rd. The 4th then moves to the 2nd table of the law, which would be honor your father and mother, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, on and on. Where a lot of the Protestants, number 2 is actually you shall not make any images and bow down to them. So we, in the Lutheran and in the Catholic traditions, that's all contained in you shall have no other gods before me.
I was telling a guy that all of our laws are derived from the 10 Commandments, especially the last 5 or 6. And so you could go to thou shalt not bear false witness, and you could, draw lines to a bunch of different laws.
Mm-hmm.
Thou shalt not steal. The whole moral code,
Right. No, you could probably distill, or you could break down almost every law and pertain it to one of the 10 Commandments. And like in our catechisms, we do that. We show that honor your father and mother also is for other authority as well. So it can branch out. Now, I think through the whole of Scripture, if we look at, obviously, the 10 Commandments, but if we look at the character of God, I would say it was better to say those 10 reflect the revelation that God gave them at that time for the particular purpose. Some of those don't extend to us today. in the New Testament, what we would call the Sabbath day is not reiterated. Paul reiterates the 9 commandments that we have. He does not reiterate the Sabbath. He even goes into where he basically breaks down, he says, do not let them judge you for days, festivals, new moons, and that, referring to that. So I think in a broader category, and I think we may be off base, is looking at the character of God best expressed through, in the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments, now best expressed through Christ himself.
There's one where God spoke to Noah about capital punishment. You know, if a man sheds another man's blood,
By
a man, his blood be shed.
Right.
And so that's a concept that has progressed over time. And that's what protected society, but it was kind of like a law separate from the 10, other than they reiterated it when it said, thou shalt do no murder.
It wouldn't be murder in that case. We're getting a little too far off. So yeah, we'll come back. I do think that talking about when God instituted capital punishment in that sense, I don't think it's been necessarily negated because I don't think it violates the commandments of thou shalt not murder. Yeah, and so, but that is a whole nother discussion. But we can come back to that at another time because we're about ready for break. So let me get through the last one, the last two. The moral law is grounds for political and social dissent. Okay? So what did you think on this point? Did anything stick out to you as you read through? Okay.
So they said without a moral law, there'd be nothing objectively wrong with Christians or Muslims, whoever, forcibly imposing their religion on atheists.
Right.
And so atheists wouldn't like that. You'd think that would make them realize that there are things that are right and wrong.
Right. And this is political and social dissent. We have ways and means to, how do I want to put this? Without the moral law, there is nothing but force, kind of what you said. That the somewhat civil system we have based on a standard, and originally in, I would say, a Judeo-Christian standard, that without that, it's again, we have might makes right. We have force is the only act of persuasion, because if there is no right or wrong, how do you convince people that your way is better or that your way moves towards the good? Do you notice that whenever we talk about progressive or progression, about moving towards a better goal, when we talk about some of these utopian ideas, morality is always there. You cannot get away from it. And so if you negate morality, you undermine all these grand concepts that people want to live on, that we're taking the higher ground, that we're not bigots, that we're this, that, and the other. Well, if morality doesn't exist, these are all castles in the sky. They really have no reality. And the last one he goes to, if there were no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. And again, we had that in the one that numbers 5 or 6 as well. Okay. So why don't we just take a quick break, and then we can come back and we'll talk about, the confusions that he refers to. So we'll take a quick break. So we will be right back, Pam. We will get going then. We'll go through this probably a little quicker. The one thing that I really like as well about this chapter is he gives some of the ideas that he gives 8 reasons why he thinks morality is undeniable. So those are the 8 we went through. But he also then goes in and he says there is some confusion about morality. There is confusion that leads people to deny it. But they really do it because of faulty reasoning. And so he gives these confusions. And so he says absolute morals versus changing behavior. A lot of the times you'll hear this. He says, we need to get on with the times. The sexual revolution has happened. The bus has left. You're here. But I love the reaction that he gives. And this is why whenever somebody gives these little sound bites, a lot of the times it's good to put in maybe another statistic or another standard to see if it applies or if there's something wrong. So what he does is he says, well, what do we say about this? Get with the times. Murder's up 25%. And what are they going to think of your argument? Oh, that's a bad thing. So it's not really the denial. A lot of it, and I like what he puts, and there's a couple of things that I like that are kind of sound bites. Sociology is descriptive. So when we think of changing behaviors, we're thinking of sociology. Sociology is descriptive. Morality is prescriptive. Okay? So just because something is described as doing something or people's behavior, that isn't really telling us maybe how we should live. It's the is versus the ought. Okay? And the is does not get us to an ought. Okay? So all this shows us is that people can violate morals. Behaviors tell us how people act. It is the is of the world around us. But again, morality is not based on the is. We have an ought, and you do not get from the is to the ought. And so again, we can bring in certain things like the murder rate. Okay? And you see that the reasoning breaks down. Okay, so that's one of the confusions that we have, absolute morals versus changing behavior. And so they'll deny absolute morals because behaviors change. Okay? Another thing they'll say is absolute morals don't exist because changing perceptions of the facts. Okay? He uses in the analogy in the book, he uses the Salem witch trials. He said, what we have is the absolute morality that was there was murder was wrong. The fact that came is our understanding of witches and what they had the ability to do. Okay? So it was an understanding of what was happening. And even if you do some research on the Salem witch trials, it's an interesting study. From my recollection, I think it was horrible, but 21 people died in the effects. And there's different ideas. So they're saying since absolute morals can't exist because we have changing perceptions, we have changing ideas. And again, it's not the change in the morals, but what is understood. Okay? So it's interesting, he gives the analogy as well under this absolute morals versus changing perceptions of the facts is cows. In India, they don't eat cows. And so you have many different people saying, from PETA and that, but really, why don't the Hindus like to eat cows?
Because they're sacred, they think they're relative.
They're reincarnations. So actually, whether you're in the East or the West, we both believe that, as he states, eating grandma is not right. We just don't think the cow is grandma. Yes.
Inherent in that, isn't it that people are reincarnated into a lesser form or a lower form?
It depends on how your...
As a punishment for this transgressions and stuff?
It is. Or you can achieve certain levels. So you can go up or down.
But the highest is human.
Well, no, in all honesty, I couldn't answer that in the sense that I think there's what are called bodhisattvas. There's other things that are higher than human, I believe.
Are they real?
Well, that's a whole nother topic.
If your grandmother is reincarnated as a fly,
Yes, they probably did something wrong to go down.
wouldn't you be doing her a favor to kill her as a fly so she can come back as something?
But then that's bad karma, yeah. But it is relativistic. You could probably argue with any position you wanted, you know? Hey, I'm helping him move on. I'm using that fly swatter, and I'm helping him move on.
Depends if she's been a good fly or a bad.
You may send her farther down the line.
So you gotta only slap the good flies. The bad flies,
Yeah.
has to be, you can't slap.
Yes.
But in that tells us that this idea of reincarnation based on good or bad behavior tells us there's a good or a bad thing. to be doing.
But yet, if you go farther in, there's no distinguishing. And he gets to that where he says Brahman is Atman and Atman is Brahman, where basically it's God playing hide and go seek with himself. Everything is a manifestation of God. So both Hitler and Mother Teresa are a manifestation. Yeah. So you have a lot of inconsistencies and incoherences. Yeah. Okay. Number 3, apply absolute morals versus applying them to particular situations. Okay. So what do you guys think about this part? Or do you have any questions? Okay.
Thought it was just interesting where they had the 5 people on a 4-people raft.
Yep, lifeboat.
And which one needed to jump off or get pushed off or whatever. And it says, well, it should be that everybody jumps off or everybody gets off.
Well, and what he's basically saying is it's usually used to show that morality is relative. But really, it wouldn't be such a difficult situation if morality was relative. It wouldn't have the difficulty. And so it really, he says, proves the point that morality is real and not illusory, or we wouldn't have difficulties with the scenario. Okay, but he goes on and he says that morality exists or it is a useless exercise, talking about the lifeboat. And it's interesting. When we apply them to particular situations, we may apply them in different ways. I'm trying to think, and my mind's not working as well tonight. What are some situations you can think of that maybe the way people apply the moral to a particular situation seems to blur it? We talked about the lifeboat. Can anybody think of?
Well, couldn't abortion be kind of that way? You know, you got,
Difficult situations.
you don't murder people, but
Designation of how do you apply it, or what is the definition, of what is a human. And he even goes into it in the book where he says, cannibals, and this is Jay Buttigieg, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name. He is a great, I have the book if you ever want to read it. It's What You Can't Not Know. And he deals with a lot of the moral arguments, or a lot of the things that are self-evident about morality. But he says there's easy and hard problems in science and math. There are difficult situations. He goes in and he says cannibals, actually, if you do research, cannibals actually do expiation ceremonies or atonement ceremonies before they perform the acts. So they know, similar to what you said about abortion, they know that what they're doing is wrong. But there's a way of cleansing themselves from it, that they have these expiation rites. And so they know they're just applying it to particular situations. Okay? An absolute command, the what, versus a relative culture, how. It's interesting, one of the And I think that the missionaries came in here, and I cannot remember where they had gone to. I think it was New Guinea. I think they were in New Guinea, and it was a tribe that they went to. And they found out, say we have that there are certain things that are decent in a culture. Okay, so the absolute command may be along the lines that we are to treat other people with decency and respect appropriately. Okay? Well, in this culture, the showing of the ankles was considered sexually provocative. But yet their women would go without shirts. They had this idea, now whether it was perverted and how we think of this, but the missionaries were having difficulties because they were wearing shirts, which was fine, and they continued to wear the shirts, but their ankles were exposed. And they were getting different reactions. But that was because this is how they thought of expressing what was to them a moral command of decency. Does that make sense? And so it was a cultural. Now he goes into, we are to respect our neighbors, love our neighbors. One of the ways that we show this is to acknowledge them. Hello, things. There's different ways you do it. Maybe you do the kiss on the side of the cheeks. Maybe you shake hands. Maybe you bow. I've even heard in some countries if you don't burp after eating, it's kind of like you've insulted them. So they confuse that people express things culturally different, that there isn't a moral command behind, why they're doing what they do. Okay? Does that make sense? Did you have a question?
No.
Okay. Then he goes on, absolute morals versus moral disagreements. And really all we have to think about this, and we try to explain it to somebody else, is if this is the case, that there are disagreements, that means there is no right answer, then all of science is a failure. Because there are disagreements all over in science. That doesn't mean that there isn't a right answer, a right evaluation, a right understanding of, quantum theory, even though I think there's 3 different theories out there right now. There may be more, there may be. But there's differences in opinions. But that doesn't mean that the subatomic world doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that those interactions aren't happening. It's that we just don't have all the details we need to make it. So just because we have disagreements does not mean that there are no right answers. Just because, you have a math test that many people get wrong answers, but there is a right answer. Okay, number 6, he goes on, this is the ends versus the means. And I think this would be very good in many instances, not all instances, in many instances, the understanding between political parties in at least being able to dialogue. He goes in and he says pacifists have the same ends as those who wage war most of the time. In the end, they want peace. They just have decided there's different ends to get that. Okay? When it comes to, and I heard a great discussion between 2 Christians, one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, this was like 5 or 6 years ago. And they went through and they evaluated why one thought big government was good, why one thought smaller government was good. Each was convinced that it was better for the populace as a whole. Now, evaluating those arguments is what we need to do. But their ends were for the prosperity of those who they were governing. Now, I'm painting with a broad stroke and I'm giving all the politicians the benefit of the doubt. So, in a perfect world, I hope you guys know what I mean. So, taking out ill motives. But I think many of them, maybe they're just have bad information. Maybe they haven't thought about their arguments. Whatever the case may be. But sometimes we confuse the ends and the means and thus think that morality doesn't exist because we think there are different ways of getting to the same spot. Okay? Then he basically goes on. The moral law. What do Darwinists say? What is the only option that What is the only option that Darwinists have? for the development of morality.
Is that it's developed over millions
Yeah.
and millions of years.
It's a slow, mindless process. That is their only option. The one thing that I would say in regards to this is, if that is the case, then everything we said before, moral law, truly does not exist in the sense of an objective moral law. All of the complications that we talked about earlier, all the difficulties, all of the contradictions and the problems, those are inherent in the outcome if evolution is true. Okay? Again, it's a mindless process. It doesn't have. Now, he goes into many different points about the problems with it. We're not going to get into a lot of those details just because of time constraints. Okay? But the one thing I would say is that, morally speaking, atheists, materialists, evolutionists have what is called the grounding problem. Now, I want to make this very clear. I don't think he made it in this book, or at least I don't remember it, that we're not saying atheists can't be good. We're not saying that materialists or evolutionists can't be good and live civilly virtuous lives, taking care of others, not being evil, whatever you may say. The problem, we need to make sure that we put this correctly, is that they have no reason to be virtuous. You can act anyway, but if this is all there is no difference between stepping on everybody to get what you want, whoever dies with the most toys wins, those kind of scenarios. So there's no grounding in the sense of making it objectively true. It is just opinion. It is just their arbitrary choice. And so that is the problem that we have with Darwinism. The thing that really gets me within morality, and this is on the questionnaire that I have kind of created, one of the things that I ask people to do is, what are the characteristics of morality? First, define morality. Second of all, what are the characteristics? Because we're really going to come down that it's immaterial. Morality doesn't have weight. It's not made up of matter. It's not made up of atoms. It's not molecular in its compound. So how does the material create the immaterial? Okay, so we have what I would call as category mistakes. We have problems. It's apples and oranges. Okay? And if they're going to persist in that, I would say then show me some observational scientific evidence or some forensic evidence that shows how morality came about in a materialistic evolutionary paradigm. Don't just give me analogies, give me examples if science is
Can
king.
it even exist?
Right, yeah.
If everything is material.
Yep. Does it in and of itself disprove the material worldview? Because if one thing, immaterial, exists, and that's why he also gets in and he says, if there is one moral law that is true for all times and all places for all people, then you have shown the absolute necessity of a moral lawgiver. Okay? So he goes through that as well, but we won't stay on that too much. So basically, he goes in and he says, I love to make people scratch their heads with these two questions. The following two statements about morality immediately capture the attention of the audience. And this is when they used to give a presentation called the 12, I think it wasn't called the 12 steps, I can't remember. But it basically was the precursor to I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, when they would go around doing these presentations. And they would say, if there is no God, then what Hitler did was just a matter of opinion. And if at least one thing is really morally wrong, like it's wrong to torture babies, or it's wrong to intentionally fly planes into buildings with innocent people in them, then God exists. Now, which one, being made in the image of God, are we going to necessarily connect with? The second one. So we, I think, with the moral argument, can use the foundation that we're all made in the image of God. When we do a lot of the other arguments, they're very convincing, but not everybody has a scientific mind. Not everybody has a philosophical mind. Not everybody has a mathematical mind. But we are all made in the image of God. and that contains a morality that he has built into us. Now, it's confused, it is faulty, but it still is there. And that is a point, I think, that the moral argument, and I think especially with the culture nowadays, is social justice is so big. It's gone so astray from any foundation, but it is still a passion to see the right thing done. That this is such a huge ability to talk to them. Okay? So, in summary, okay, my clicker will work. There is an absolute standard of right and wrong that is written on the hearts of every human being. That is a great starting point. Okay? Number 2, relativism is false. Human beings do not determine right and wrong. We discover right and wrong. Relativism, it's been a long day. Relativism is false because it's unlivable. It actually tends to contradict itself when it's lived out. So the concept in and of itself is not contradictory, but when you live it out, it's, if you want to call, hypocritical. It declare one thing and live another. Okay. Number 3, this moral law must have a source higher than ourselves because it is a prescription that is on the hearts of all people. If it comes from people, it is a description. It's the is. And again, we cannot get an ought from an is. Okay? Number 4, this moral law is God's standard of rightness, and it helps us adjudicate or judge between the different moral opinions people may have. Really, it's the basis of human values, human rights. Although it's widely believed that all morality is relative, core moral values are absolute and they transcend cultures. We see that in the references when it comes to the cannibals and the expiation ceremonies. Okay? 6, atheists have no real basis for objective right or wrong. No matter what evolutionary twist or spin you put on it, molecules have no morality. And it truly is, as one scientist said, it's magic. You just don't have the magician because you have an immaterial thing coming from material. Okay. So, any other thoughts on that chapter? Nothing? Okay.
I got one.
Yeah, go for
I think it was a couple back where it says we discover.
Uh-huh.
Did it say we discover morality,
Yes.
or do we experience
Well, that would be a type of.
the same?
You can learn in many different ways. So discovering things can be done experientially. It can be done propositionally, meaning someone tells you how it is. We see that especially with the Word of God. So any way you would get to know a person, if morality is really just the extension of God's character and person, then getting to know Him would be discovering those moral attributes. So whether it's through, so we could discover it any other way we learn about things.
So like parents teaching their kids about morality.
Those kids would be discovering it through
and
their
those
parents.
kids go, oh man, I'm not buying this. But later on in life, they're in a situation where they experience it, therefore they discover that what mom and dad said is actually right.
Well, they may mature in that way. I would say they first discovered it when it was taught to them. They disagreed with it and they violated it. Then it became something that they knew to be true. So that would be more, so, and without getting into, but yeah, so those, however it is along that train, they discovered it. It's not something that they created. It's something that they discovered that is in line with God's character. Yep. All right. So tactics. Really, there's not much. I don't even know if we have to go off a whole bunch on this. because really, so we're starting in part 2, finding the flaws in tactics, chapter 10, okay, suicide views that self-destruct. So really, this is just the Roadrunner tactic. So we learned about the Roadrunner tactic in chapter 2 of I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And what this basically is there are statements that violate the law of non-contradiction. And so since they're contradictory, they are necessarily false. So I like how he puts it this way. I do like the way he elaborates. He says, every statement is about something. Sometimes this statement includes themselves in what they refer to. Similar to his example, I think in the book was, everything said in English is a lie. Okay? If they cannot satisfy their own standard, they fall on their own sword. They are self-refuting and false by necessity. I prefer, I don't speak a word of English. Okay? Obviously, it was in English. It doesn't stand up to its own standard. It's contradictory. It violates the second law of non-contradiction. And so it is false. Okay? And so he's saying that sometimes we don't have to do any heavy lifting. People will make it easy for us, kind of like when people say there is no truth. Well, they're expecting you to think that's a true statement. And so they're saying at one time there is truth, and then at the same time there is no truth. It contradicts. And he calls this formal suicide. The reason he calls it formal suicide is because he actually gets into, which is kind of fascinating in other chapters in the book, he'll get into like fratricide or patricide, where it's not contradictory until it's lived out. Maybe the statement, the proposition is not false, but when you try to live it out, kind of in the area of where we talked about morality, you can say morality doesn't exist, but your actions will show that you don't believe it. You will contradict your words by your actions. So this is what he calls formal suicide. Formal suicide is where the statement itself self-destructs. It's incoherent. Does that make sense? Okay. So I like what he says, and I kind of labeled these. He had some of the labels where he had talked about it. But so when you're wondering if a statement may fit this category, he says, first, pay attention to the basic idea, premise, conviction, or claim. So I put this in my notes as identify the claim. What is the statement referring to and what does it contain? Next, ask if the statement applies to itself. So this I labeled as application. Does it apply to itself? First, we identify what the claim is. Second, we see if it applies to the statement itself, okay? Then, if so, is there a conflict? So do the standards, is it a failure of its own standards? So a failure, as explained by the law of non-contradiction. Then we simply point out the contradiction. Obviously, because of just learning the Columbo tactics, we try to put it in a question form. And he gives examples of that in the book, okay? Now, you guys, this is the force really behind the problem of pain issue. Many atheists believe there's a contradiction. They believe that this is an incoherent statement and then necessarily false. That's why we as Christians need to make sure that when we're talking about that situation, that evil can coexist with a loving, omnipotent God. We need to know how to explain that sometimes if the burden of proof is on us. But that is what they're trying to get to with the problem of evil. But it's a misunderstanding of the things involved. They think it's a contradiction, and it is not. And we need to help them to see that. Okay? I love this. He put in there, even God cannot give life to a contradictory notion. So, I liked this, and this is a note that I put down. Many people believe self-refuting ideas. He has a section of why do so many people believe it? And I think you could sum it up is that no one has ever shown them the problem. You guys, we're not in a culture of deep thinking. And really, sometimes an easy question. You do get those. I remember some of the kids coming back when we were at Berkeley. I remember the first time again, Nathan, when I went with Nathan. Nathan came back and he had told me. He said, some of them said, thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. They didn't get mad. Questions opened it up. And all of a sudden they're like, wow, sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? You know, no one's ever questioned them on these things. And so when we do it in a gracious, loving way, I think people are open to know when they are wrong. So he goes into, I think it was 4, no, how many? He goes into 9 contradictions that are espoused today. Okay, so they are, is truth true? Can God make a rock so big he cannot move it? God doesn't take sides, to err is human. Atman versus Brahma, and Brahman is Atman. Theistic evolution, designed by chance. Only science gives reliable truth. Religious suicide and religious pluralism, and you are what you eat. So he goes into those. Those are some of the more common ones. And so he goes into detail in the book about why those are problems. So he gives you an additional kind of idea of some of those common. And if you have trouble conceptually, go through and read them again and again and get them, because they're very illustrative. I think they're usable in different areas. You know, he has a direct problem, and then he elaborates on it. And then a lot of the times he gives a quick response or a conversation. Okay? All right. So that is basically what we went over. Any questions or any thoughts, any difficulties with any of the material in that chapter? No?
Just a lot to take in and
There
try to
is.
use.
Yeah.
Try-
And again, you guys, this a lot of the time is, the mind is an amazing thing. What we're trying to do is expose you. These are new concepts, new ideas, new ways of looking at things. You're going to lose a lot of it. That self-help guide that he has that you can stick in your Bible is always good to remind yourself. And using the books for reference, and then digging into those areas when you have a chance. Because,
Or just rereading.
oh yeah, rote repetition. It really is. But at least you've got that in the back of your head, so hopefully when some difficulty comes up or some problem comes up, there's a little thing in the back of your head that says, I know I've read something about this, or I've thought about it, and hopefully, will help in that situation. So the survey and discussion sheets, I'll give these out, and Pam, I'll send you one on file. This I just created today. And it's just a combination of questions. And so what I've been trying to do is, on certain topics that we get throughout, I thought it would be good to have a survey that you could use on that particular topic. So as you can see, and let me turn to mine really quick. Okay. So the first one, obviously, I have just what is morality? Okay. But with this question more, it's what would your definition and what are its characteristics? I want them to positively define what morality is. I want them to think about its characteristics. And so there's some follow-up questions. Does it have real existence, or is it an illusion? What makes something right or wrong? So when you're thinking about characteristics, part of that is what makes up morality. Well, there's obligation. Well, obligation is usually only paid between people or, living. We have obligations to dogs. Dogs don't have obligations to us, or at least in their minds. Okay? How about the immateriality? These are immaterial concepts. So those are some of the areas that you can delve into when you ask the question, what is morality? Then the second one, so morality is you're defining what it is. The second question is, how do we come to know what is right or wrong? Now, remember, a lot of these questions hopefully will bring out contradictions in their thinking. The whole purpose of these surveys is to show where they have contradictions in their worldview, they have problems, things that don't match reality, okay? How do we come to know what is right or wrong? Is it our culture, family, religion? If not, what are other ways? Does any of these ways necessarily make it true? You guys can add, these are just kind of starter questions to go on. I ask then, is morality objective or subjective? Is it something in the world or is it something in us? Is it our opinion or does it have reality out there? Okay. Is it just opinion or is it more than that? Is there anything that is always wrong at all times, places, and situations? I bet they may be able to find some. And then maybe that idea that comes back that if there's one thing that is absolutely wrong in all times, places, and that, then we have a lawgiver, or we have a necessity of a lawgiver. I have what is justice? What is your definition? And who has the authority to carry out justice? Why or why not? Can you have justice if everything is relative? If relative, then who is the judge? These starts getting them into questions about the necessity of standards that don't change, of that this can't be harbored in just opinion and subjective persuasion, because then in a lot of cases their ideas are wrong. They really don't have the authority. How do you evaluate between conflicting moral judgments? So in the case, whose law takes precedence in conflicts? If you're in a place where you have a very loyal Muslim, which takes priority? Islamic law, Sharia, or legislative laws set by a secular government? How do you evaluate between those? Okay. Is there something outside of both to appeal to? Then I also put in there, what about the Nuremberg trials and the Nazis' defense that they were lawful in Germany? Okay. So you see where these questions, these are just digging. Then we get into the can science and evolution explain morality? So can science give us an adequate foundation and source? If so, please explain why with either observational or forensic science. Okay, if science is king and morality comes about, don't give me a just so story, give me the evidence. What studies have been done? What do they show? What's your evidence to use to support? He goes in I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, this last chapter, he also went into what is an assertion and what is an argument. An assertion is a statement of a conclusion. An argument is the assertion with evidence to back it. And we need to make sure that they don't just make assertions and then get off the hook for giving any of the evidential reasoning behind it. Remember the questions that we have, especially with Columbo. How did you come to that conclusion? What is the reason? Why do you believe that's true? Okay. Then I also put it as, what is the basis for human rights? Is it given to us by government or God? If by government, then if we object, is there a higher standard we can appeal to? If society and government give it, can they rightfully take them away? And you see how I used may or may not, but human rights, can they rightfully take it away? I mean, it's a play on words, but yet it's still, hopefully they will understand that, is it morally right to oppose them if they are the ones that grant them? Okay. How important is morality to everyday life? Okay. Does it pervade every decision we make, or is it important only when conflicts arise? If important, how often do we evaluate what we believe? This is where I think we really can hit the point where everything that comes out of our mouth to one degree or another is a value judgment. Think about it sometime. When you start making statements, was I praising something or was I condemning something? Was I advising somebody or was I refuting somebody? I mean, really almost everything we say, we wouldn't be saying it if we didn't think it had value to a certain degree. But I think people don't realize how much morality pervades absolutely every decision that they make. What would a society look like if morality didn't exist? Would it be a place you would want to live? How do you think things would be both different and the same? Get them to use their God-given imagination to try to see what it would be like. Okay? I think people will, for the first part, I think they will think of, and even movies nowadays, what is it called, The Purge? There's a movie called The Purge where one day a year you can do anything you want and nothing is illegal. And it even comes out in movie form. And then there was a newest one was called The Forever Purge, where it was supposed to stop, but it didn't. That's the kind of world we would have with no morality. Or at least, might makes right, I should say, would be the morality. Okay, the last one. When a government passes laws, is it legislating morality? The reason I put this in is more just to put the bug in their brain that laws are all moral decisions. Because they always say, we don't want you Christians legislating morality. What are you doing? Everyone is legislating morality. That is what it is. But people don't think that way. For some reason, they only think that Christians legislate morality. And it's one of those misconceptions that you want to break. So is this right or wrong, that when the government passes laws, it is legislating morality? What if you oppose? What is the right thing to do? Doesn't matter if you are religious or not when you legislate. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave, you probably remember this conversation we had with an atheist one time, and one of his big concerns with Christians was getting involved in politics or, legislating their fundamental beliefs or whatever, in law. And,
Yep.
And he was making all kinds of value statements, and we kept trying to push him on it. And he, it was the funniest thing. I still remember it. And he said it numerous times, and he just didn't quite. We were trying to point it out to him. It was like he kept saying, "I'm not making any claims. I'm not making any claims." And I'm like, "What?"
Really? It is. I don't. And probably in that case, because I think I talked to you about it, he really just didn't understand. It's not he was being stubborn. He just hadn't thought through it.
And I think towards the end of the night, I think he was stubborn too, where he didn't want to.
Now he's
at
not
the
going
same, at
to.
the same time either. He didn't want to lose the debate.
There is, and if that is a topic that you get into discussions about a lot, there is a book, and I think Geisler is the one who wrote it. It's called Legislating Morality. And it's all about, the moral and how to address those situations. So why don't we just close with prayer, and then we will be good until the 30th. Cool. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, we thank you for your grace. Lord, I do pray that through the reading of the book and through our discussion, whether we fumble or not, that, Lord, you would just help us to grow in the knowledge of you and the world that you have created. Lord, we thank you that you have given us people who have gone before us, that have thought about these difficult questions, who have evaluated and tested and have passed on their knowledge to us. Lord, I do pray that you would help us to grow in knowledge and in faith so that we can impart that to others, family, friends, whoever it may be, Lord. So, Lord, we thank you for your grace and your love. We pray now that you, over these next 2 weeks, would just be with us as we live our lives. I pray that you would protect and keep us, especially in our faith. So, Lord, now we thank you, especially for your Son. In his name we pray. Amen.